The story of the M26 Pershing does not begin with triumph. It begins with frustration, fear, and a growing realization that the most powerful nation on Earth had gone into the greatest war in history without a true heavy tank. By 1944, American armored crews had spent nearly 3 years fighting in steel coffins, Sherman tanks that were fast, reliable, and easy to produce, but horrifyingly outmatched when facing the German Panthers and Tigers that roamed Europe like armored predators. Every tanker knew the terror of seeing a long 75 or 88mm barrel emerge from a tree line. Every crew had watched a Sherman 75mm shell bounce off a Panther's glossus like a thrown pebble. Every man inside a burning tank had lived the truth that Washington had refused to accept. America was fighting a tank war with a machine designed for infantry support, not for tank duels. The Sherman was a good tank, but the war had evolved, and the Sherman had not. And while American officers filed urgent reports from North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy, begging for a tank that could stand toe-to-toe with German armor, those pleas struck a wall of doctrine and bureaucracy. The Ordnance Department insisted that U.S. tanks should support infantry, not engage other tanks. Tank destroyers were supposed to handle that role. It was a beautiful theory, on paper. On the battlefield, theory meant nothing. What mattered was the brutal reality that when a Tiger or Panther appeared, the Sherman was the one facing it. And too often, the Sherman died before it could even fire its second shot. American tankers understood this truth long before the generals did. They talked about the Panthers with a sour mix of respect and resentment. "It's like they built it to kill us," one gunner in Italy muttered. They joked bitterly about the Sherman's gasoline engine, lights up first time every time, a grim reference to how quickly the tank burned when hit. They traded stories of ambushes where a single Panther held up an entire battalion. They memorized the weak spots on Tigers, even though none of them expected to live long enough to use that knowledge. Each new firefight carved the same lesson deeper into the minds of American crews. We need a bigger gun, stronger armor, and a tank that fights like theirs, not like ours. But back in the United States, in offices far from the mud and smoke of Europe, the gears of change turned slowly. Engineers had already begun experimenting with heavier tank designs, T-20, T-22, T-23, T-25, and finally T-26, but development staggered under arguments about weight, engines, transport limitations, and doctrine. The U.S. Army believed mobility and numbers would always beat firepower and armor. After all, it worked against older German tanks in 1942 and 1943. Why change a system that was good enough? Tankers in the field had an answer. Because Panther and Tiger weren't 1942 tanks. They were something new, machines that punished outdated doctrine with terrifying efficiency. But in the slow grind of bureaucracy, the voice of the battlefield often arrived too late. Meetings were held, reports were rewritten, requirements were debated. The war moved forward without waiting. And as American factories poured out tens of thousands of Shermans, the Panther rolled onto the eastern and western fronts like a harbinger of a new era. Its sloped armor, high-velocity 75mm cannon, and long-range optics made it a nightmare in every engagement. The Tiger, larger and slower, but almost mythically durable, added another layer of dread. Sherman crews learned to identify Tigers not by sight, but by sound, the deep, growling rumble of the Maybach engine that seemed to vibrate the earth itself. The first time a Tiger knocked out 5 Shermans in a row near Anzio, American officers realized they weren't just losing tanks, they were losing time, momentum, and morale. And yet still, the Pershing did not arrive. It wasn't because Americans couldn't build a heavy tank, it was because they hadn't committed to building one. Not yet. The T-26 prototype existed, tested, waiting, but delayed by endless revisions. It had a real gun, a 90mm cannon that could shatter a Panther at respectable range. It had armor thick enough to withstand German fire. It had a silhouette that promised a new chapter in American armor history. But decisions came slowly, fatally slowly. The war burned on while America debated. Tankers kept dying while committees discussed horsepower ratios. It was a crisis of doctrine wrapped in a crisis of timing. The M26 Pershing was ready long before the Army was ready to accept it. And because of that, it became the symbol of every lesson the United States learned the hard way, late, painfully, and at the cost of lives. By mid-1944, as American forces fought through hedgerows and towns across France, the calls for a heavier tank became deafening. Commanders at the front practically begged for the T-26. Reports from Normandy repeated the same message. Shermans could win battles, but at a terrible price. The enemy was evolving faster than the doctrine. Soldiers wondered if Washington had forgotten that wars aren't won by theories. They're won by steel, blood, and the ability to adapt before your enemy does. In this atmosphere of fear, anger, and desperate hope, the Pershing became more than a tank. It became a promise, a whisper that maybe, finally, America was ready to fight German armor on equal terms. But the truth was harsh. The Pershing was coming, but far too slowly. Too many committees, too many revisions, too many fears of repeating the disastrous T-28 Super Heavy tank project. The men who needed the Pershing most were the ones who could not wait. And as 1944 gave way to 1945, with the Reich collapsing and the war nearing its end, the M26 Pershing was on the brink of deployment. Powerful, overdue, and carrying the weight of every American tanker who had ever stared down a Panther and thought, if only we had something better. The tank that could have saved hundreds of lives was finally ready, but the war was almost over, and in that cruel timing lay the beginning of its legend. The birth of the M26 Pershing was not a moment, it was a struggle. A long and bitter campaign fought not on battlefields but in warehouses, test grounds, drafting rooms, and conference tables where engineers and officers clashed over the very soul of American armored doctrine. The Pershing did not emerge from confidence, it emerged from doubt. Doubt that the Sherman could continue carrying the weight of a war it was never designed for, and doubt that American tank theory, forged in the interwar years, could survive contact with the brutal reality of German engineering. In many ways, the Pershing was America arguing with itself. The story began with the T-20 series in 1942, long before the world had heard of the Panther. The T-20 was intended to be the Sherman's successor, a sleeker design with heavier firepower and new technology. But from the moment the first prototypes rolled across test courses, the Army found reasons to delay. High-dramatic transmissions slipped, electrical systems failed, the fear of producing a flawed successor weighed heavily on a military machine that had grown comfortable with the Sherman's reliability. And so instead of accelerating development, the Army hesitated. They improved some parts, redesigned others, and added months to the timeline. Meanwhile, American tankers were already dying in North Africa, and Germany was already preparing machines far beyond what the T-20 engineers imagined. The next step, the T-23, was a radical leap, an electric transmission, smooth and futuristic. It handled beautifully in testing, but electrical reliability terrified commanders. They worried about field repairs, they worried about production, and once again, theory trumped necessity. The T-23 was approved for limited production, but never shipped overseas. A working next-generation tank sat in storage while the Sherman continued fighting battles it was outgunned in. A private in the 3rd Armored Division once said bitterly, "We don't need perfect. We need something that doesn't get us killed." But perfection, or the illusion of it, continued delaying progress. Then came the T-25 and T-26, designs that finally embraced the reality that American tankers had known since the first Tiger appeared. The next American tank needed more armor and a bigger gun. The T-25 mounted a 75mm high-velocity cannon similar to the Panther's. The T-26 went further, equipping a 90mm gun that could punch through German armor at ranges where the Sherman's round simply evaporated. On the test range, the 90mm gun tore gaping holes through steel plates designed to simulate German frontal armor. Observers watched the shells punch through and whispered to each other, stunned, "That'll kill a Tiger." The T-26's turret was redesigned to fit the massive breech of the 90mm gun. Armor was thickened, the silhouette grew imposing. The tank was no longer a polite infantry support machine, it was a brawler, a challenger, something meant not to avoid German armor, but to confront it head-on. Test drivers said the T-26 felt solid, like a tank that wouldn't crumble under the first enemy hit.
Engineers stood around the hull, touching the armor as if feeling the future. This was what the soldiers needed. This was what the war demanded. But even then, politics intervened. American doctrine still clung to the idea that tank destroyers, not tanks, should handle enemy armor. Building a heavy tank capable of fighting Tigers directly challenged that doctrine. Generals questioned whether they needed a heavy tank at all, insisting the Sherman's mobility and overwhelming numbers were enough. They pointed to statistics showing the Sherman won most engagements, without acknowledging those victories often came at a horrifying cost. Reports from Normandy, Italy, and France told the truth brutally. Sherman units could win, but only by paying in blood. Platoons lost half their tanks in a single encounter with a Panther ambush. Veterans began calling Panthers the Sherman collectors. And still, the Pershing waited for approval. Each week lost was another battlefield where American crews faced armor that outclassed them. When the T-26E3 finally received its combat designation as the M26 Pershing, the war was entering its final year. Engineers rushed to complete production, factories scrambled to retool. The first Pershings rolled out in late 1944, too late for Normandy, too late for the breakout across France, too late for the worst battles Sherman crews had endured. The men who saw Pershings boarding ships in January 1945 stared with disbelief at its broad turret and menacing cannon. Some whispered angrily that this was the tank that should have arrived in 1943. Others touched its armor like it was a long-lost answer to prayers they'd stopped saying. When the first batch of 20 Pershings arrived in Europe in February 1945, they were greeted not with ceremony, but with exhaustion. Tankers who had survived 2 years of fighting felt something close to grief. "If we had this a year ago," one veteran muttered, "half my friends would still be alive." It was a heavy burden for a new machine to carry, the weight of what might have been. But the truth was undeniable. Despite delays and resistance, the M26 Pershing represented a breakthrough in American tank design. It brought together every lesson written in blood from Tunisia to the Ardennes. Sloped armor, a powerful gun, better suspension, a turret built to fight, not to observe. The Pershing embodied the transformation of U.S. armor doctrine from quantity first to quality driven. It didn't matter that it arrived too late to change World War II. What mattered, what history would remember, was that it arrived just in time to change everything after. The Pershing was not the tank that won the war. It was the tank that forced America to rethink how wars should be fought. It was the tank that paved the way for the Patton series, the M60, and ultimately the M1 Abrams. The Pershing wasn't built for 1944. It was built for 1945 and for every year that followed.
When the siege closed around Bastogne, there were no clear front lines, only white, broken silhouettes of trees, the smell of cordite, and the constant grind of engines somewhere beyond the fog. The Germans were everywhere and nowhere at once. Their tanks moved like ghosts through the woods, their infantry slipping between shadows. For the men of the 101st Airborne and 10th Armored Division, every direction meant danger. There was no retreat, no resupply, no warm place left in the world. And yet, on the edges of that frozen town, the Browning M1919A4 crews refused to go silent. Each day began not with sunrise, but with artillery. German shells screamed overhead at dawn, tearing through the roofs of barns and churches. The defenders huddled in holes carved into the frozen soil, praying the next shell wouldn't land in their sector. When the bombardment ended, there was a hush, a moment of waiting so tense it hurt to breathe. Then, from the mist, came the attack. Columns of German infantry, white smocks blending into the snow, pushed forward under the cover of mortars and machine guns. They expected the Americans to crumble, to be too cold and too scattered to fight back. Instead, they met the deep, rhythmic thunder of the Brownings. At the southern approaches near Marvy, a team from the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment held a narrow road against repeated attacks. They had one functioning M1919A4, its barrel already worn silver from heat. The gunner, Sergeant Earl Red Watson, was 23, his assistant barely 19. For 3 nights, they manned the weapon without rest. German half-tracks and infantry tried to cross the open field. their shapes flickering in the snow flares. The Browning's bursts cut through them, controlled, deliberate, never panicked. It sounded like someone hammering a church bell, a nearby medic recalled. Every time it started, you knew we were still holding. Watson's team fired nearly 12,000 rounds in a single night, their hands blistered and blackened from touching the overheated barrel. When ammunition belts froze stiff, they laid them across their bodies to thaw them. When the guns smoked from the cold, they shoveled snow onto it, hissing clouds rising like breath from a dragon. At dawn, the field in front of their position was silent, except for the faint ticking of cooling metal. Later, they would find more than 100 German dead in the snow, some lying in the same white camouflage they'd used to disappear. In the village of Foy, the Browning teams of the 501st Parachute Infantry held the churchyard, using gravestones as firing positions. Snow mixed with mud and blood beneath their boots. The Germans sent mortar after mortar, trying to silence the guns. But each time one crew was hit, another man crawled forward and took his place. A corporal named Frank Dillon remembered dragging a wounded gunner away from his tripod and setting the weapon back into position. You couldn't let it stop. If one went quiet, they came. So you fired, no matter what. To the soldiers of Bastogne, the Browning's voice became a kind of prayer, a steady rhythm that meant the line still lived. The Germans learned it too. Prisoners later told interrogators that the Americans' machine guns were unnervingly consistent. They did not fire in fear. They fired like they were counting seconds. Across the ring of defenses, the same stories played out. In the woods north of town, a gun section from the 502nd Parachute Infantry was surrounded for almost 36 hours. Their radio batteries were dead, their rations gone, and frostbite was claiming fingers. They fired until the last belt ran dry, then scavenged ammo from fallen comrades. When the assistant gunner's gloves froze to the receiver, he ripped them free, leaving skin behind. They stacked snow around the tripod to anchor it against recoil and fired until the barrel glowed cherry red. When relief finally arrived, only one man was still conscious. His finger still curled on the trigger, the gun barrel fused from heat. The M1919A4 was not a miracle of design, it was a triumph of reliability. Its air cooling system, simple bolt assembly, and rugged steel frame made it indifferent to the elements. Where the Germans' water-cooled MG-08s had long since frozen, and their newer MG-42s required constant cleaning, the Browning kept working. Its slow, deliberate cadence actually saved it. Less friction, less heat, less chance of seizing. Soldiers joked that the gun had lungs. It breathed the snow, coughed up smoke, and kept talking. By December 21st, the siege had entered its worst phase. The German 2nd Panzer Division attacked from the northeast, while elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division probed the southern roads. Tanks appeared out of the fog, their engines growling like beasts in the white forest. Against them, the Browning crews were almost helpless, but not useless. They aimed at the infantry instead, cutting down the supporting grenadiers before they could close in with Panzerfausts. Every burst delayed the next charge. Every belt of ammo bought time for the artillery to regroup, for Patton's Third Army to reach them. Inside the town itself, the 101st Airborne's command post, set in the Bastogne Seminary, shook from nearby explosions. General McAuliffe's men were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of food. But every report from the perimeter began the same way. Our Brownings still operational. In one after-action log, a lieutenant scribbled the words, "They're freezing, they're starving, but the guns still sing." Night was the worst. The cold deepened, the fog thickened, and the battlefield vanished into blackness. The Germans tried to infiltrate between American lines, creeping silently in the snow, but every time they got close, a Browning opened up, its orange muzzle flash lighting the trees, tracer rounds cutting ribbons through the night. The sound of the gun echoed from hill to hill, bouncing off ice and timber until it seemed like the whole forest was alive with defiance. There were moments when everything else stopped. Artillery gone silent, mortars spent, rifles frozen. Only the Brownings remained. In that stillness, their roar became the heartbeat of Bastogne itself. Soldiers on the far side of town could tell when another sector was under attack by the pattern of the guns. Short bursts meant probing fire, long bursts meant a full assault. It was like Morse code, said one paratrooper. The Brownings talked to each other through the snow. On December 23rd, the sky finally cleared. For the first time in a week, sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off the snow like shattered glass. The men thought it was a trick of the cold until they heard the faint hum above them, the sound of C-47s. The long-awaited airlift had arrived. Parachutes blossomed across the sky, carrying crates of food, medicine, and, most importantly, ammunition. The Browning crews cheered, though most could barely move their frozen lips. They reloaded their belts and fired into the distance, not at the enemy this time, but as a salute. That day, the defenders of Bastogne were still surrounded, still bleeding, still half-frozen, but they knew the line would hold, because the guns had never stopped. When mortars failed, when rifles froze, when men fell asleep sitting upright from exhaustion, the Brownings kept their rhythm. It wasn't just the sound of firepower, it was the sound of defiance. And as dusk fell again over the Ardennes, with smoke curling up from shattered barns and snow still drifting through the trees, the last thing the Germans heard was that same stubborn drum beat echoing through the forest. The song of the Brownings, singing for a town that refused to die.
When the guns fell silent in Europe and the smoke drifted away from the ruined cities, most tanks of World War II began their slow journey into obsolescence. The Tiger became a museum piece. The Panther was studied, then scrapped. Even the Sherman, heroic and iconic as it was, had reached the limits of what its narrow hull and small turret ring could support. But the Pershing, the tank that had barely tasted battle, the machine that arrived on the continent when the war was already collapsing under Germany's defeat, was just beginning its life. The war may have ended too soon for the Pershing to prove its worth on the fields of Europe, but the years that followed would show that the M26 was not the late arrival of American armor. It was the foundation of everything that came next. When the armies of the world lined up after 1945 to study the wreckage of the conflict, they weren't looking at the Shermans or the aging light tanks that had served since North Africa. They were looking at the future. And the future was written into the steel bones of the Pershing. The first thing military planners recognized was that the era of lightly armed, lightly armored medium tanks was over. The appearance of the Panther and Tiger had made that undeniable. World War II had been a graveyard for outdated doctrines. Tanks were no longer support weapons. They were the decisive land predators of mechanized warfare. If a nation wanted to dominate future battlefields, it would need a tank that could fight and win armored duels, withstand heavy fire, and deliver killing blows at long range. The Pershing embodied that new philosophy. Its 90mm gun, its thick glacis armor, its wide turret ring built for upgrades, everything about it pointed toward a new category of machines. Not light tanks, not medium tanks, not heavy tanks. Something else. Something that would, in time, become known as the main battle tank. But as revolutionary as its design was, the Pershing still had flaws. Flaws revealed not by the Germans, but by the unforgiving terrain of a different war entirely. In 1950, when North Korea's T-34-85s poured across the 38th parallel, the Sherman once again struggled. Its 76mm gun had trouble defeating the sloped Soviet armor except at close range. The M24 Chaffee, fast but lightly armed, was nearly useless. Panic spread through U.S. forces as T-34s smashed through thin American lines. History seemed to repeat itself. Another war, another adversary fielding a tank that outclassed America's frontline machines. But this time, however, something was different. This time, the Pershing was already waiting. M26s were rushed from depots in Japan and the United States into Korea as fast as ships could carry them. On the barren hills and rice paddies of the peninsula, the Pershing finally fought the tank duels it had been built for, and it was devastating. Its 90mm cannon tore through T-34s with ease. Its armor shrugged off shots at ranges where the Shermans were dying.
In firefights around Pusan, Incheon, and the Changchon River, the Pershing proved decisively that America had finally built a tank equal or superior to its global rivals. Tank crews in Korea quickly learned a truth the men of 1944 could only dream about. When the enemy's tank appeared, they no longer had to fear it. They could go toward it. But the Pershing's impact was not limited to combat performance. It became the blueprint, the DNA from which every American tank for the next half-century would evolve. Engineers looked at the M26 and asked, how do we fix what's weak but preserve what's strong? The result was the M46 Patton, a Pershing with a modern engine and drivetrain. The M46 became the M47, with a redesigned turret and improved fire control. The M48 evolved into the M48, the first tank that looked unmistakably modern, with its rounded turret, sleek hull, and thermal smokescreen capabilities. And then came the M60, one of the most successful tank families in the world, serving into the 1990s. Every one of those tanks, Patton, 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 and finally the M60, carried Pershing's lineage in its mechanical heart. Without the Pershing, there is no M46. Without the M46, no M47. Without those, the M48 and M60 do not exist. And without that evolutionary chain, the United States would never have built the M1 Abrams, the crown jewel of American armor, the tank that still dominates the world's battlefields today. The Pershing also changed American strategy. No longer would the U.S. rely on the doctrine that tank destroyers fight tanks. The Pershing proved that tanks must be able to defeat tanks, period. No workarounds, no theoretical divisions of labor. The next war, the next generation, everything demanded a single universal fighting machine capable of crushing enemy armor, supporting infantry, surviving artillery, and dominating open terrain. The Sherman was a product of its time. The Pershing was a product of the future. Even foreign militaries studied it. Allied nations who had fought beside Sherman crews marveled at the power of the Pershing. Nations planning their post-war arsenals asked for U.S. advice, and U.S. officers pointed not to the Sherman, but to the Pershing. In Europe, NATO's early armored doctrine borrowed heavily from ideas the Pershing embodied: wide turret rings for future upgrades, high-velocity guns, balanced armor, reliable powertrains. The Pershing's shadow stretched across continents. And yet the strangest part of its legacy was its humility. It did not earn fame the way Tiger or Sherman did. It did not fight in every major battle. It did not carry a reputation shaped by thousands of engagements. The Pershing stayed quiet, unassuming, almost anonymous. But in that quiet, it accomplished something far greater than glory. It changed the direction of American armored warfare forever. When veterans visited museums decades later, many walked past the Shermans with nostalgia, past the Pattons with admiration, past the Abrams with awe. But when they paused in front of a Pershing, their voices softened. They understood what it represented. It was the promise they never received in time, the tank that could have saved lives in 1944, the machine that arrived too late for their friends, but right on time for every American tanker who came afterward. One veteran touching the cold steel of an M26's hull said quietly, This one is the father of them all." The Sherman won the war, but the Pershing shaped everything that came after it. It was the tank that missed its war, but defined every war that followed.
The Pershing never marched in victory parades, never broke through enemy lines in great sweeping maneuvers, never became the iconic silhouette of World War II. It arrived too late for that, stepping onto the stage when the war was already collapsing under the weight of a starving German army and Allied air supremacy. But history has its own way of choosing what matters, and sometimes the machines that fire the fewest shots end up casting the longest shadows. The M26 Pershing, born from hesitation and deployed in desperation, became exactly that. A quiet giant whose true legacy lived not in what it destroyed, but in what it inspired. When commanders evaluated post-war armored performance, the Pershing stood out not for its kill count, but for its potential.
It was the first American tank that proved the United States could build something powerful enough to challenge the best German armor on equal terms. It shattered the old doctrine of quantity over quality and forced military planners to accept a new truth. Modern warfare demanded a tank that could do everything: break through, exploit, defend, and engage enemy armor directly. The Pershing didn't just hint at the future, it became the blueprint for it. The evolution was immediate. The M26's biggest flaw was its underpowered engine. Its reliable but insufficient four-GAF V8 struggled to move the tank's 46 tons with agility. Engineers replaced it with a new power plant, modernized the drivetrain, and refined the suspension. The result was the M46 Patton, the first tank that truly built on the Pershing's foundation. With improved mobility, a redesigned hull, and upgraded fire controls, it was the first American tank that felt like it belonged in the emerging Cold War landscape. But evolution didn't stop there. The M47 Patton followed. Faster, stronger, a transitional tank that brought post-war armor into the modern era. Then came the M58 Patton, a tank that many consider the first true main battle tank America ever fielded. And from the M58 emerged the tank that defined American armor for 3 decades, the M60, with its powerful 105mm gun, upgraded optics, and thick, imposing turret. All of these tanks, Patton, and the venerable M60, carried Pershing's DNA. The turret shapes, the focus on gun stabilization, the balance of firepower and protection, the doctrine that tanks must be ready to fight tanks, all of it began with the M26. It was as if Pershing's silhouette stood behind every drawing board, reminding engineers, this is where we started, now make it better. But the Pershing's true legacy would not be fully realized until 1980, when the first M1 Abrams rolled out of Detroit Arsenal. Sleek, angular, armored with CHOPM composite plating, powered by a gas turbine engine that screamed like a jet, and armed with a 105mm, later 120mm cannon that could kill at distances World War II tankers could barely imagine. The Abrams was everything the Sherman never had been, and everything the Pershing had tried to become. The Abrams didn't just inherit the Pershing's technological lineage, it inherited its spirit. A tank built not for the last war, but for the next. A tank designed not around doctrine, but around battlefield necessity. A tank created because America finally understood that to defend itself and lead the free world, it needed the best, not the most. Veterans who had fought in Pershings during the Korean War visited Abrams units decades later. They touched the armor, listened to the turbine whine, and some smiled softly. We always knew that what started with Pershing had to end here. The line from M26 to Abrams wasn't just mechanical, it was philosophical. It was the story of a nation learning to take armored warfare seriously. In museums today, children run past Shermans because they've seen them in movies. They stop briefly at Tigers, fascinated by their size, but when they reach the Pershing, they pause, unsure why this tank, less famous, less celebrated, feels different. A docent might explain that the Pershing saw little combat, or that it arrived just as the war was ending. But if they look closely, they will notice the well-organized layout of the turret, the balanced design of the hull, the sloped armor that hinted at future doctrine, and the unmistakable presence of a machine built not for desperation, but for evolution. The Pershing stands in museums like a shadow cast across time, quiet, proud, a reminder that even a tank that comes too late can change everything that comes after. Its guns fired only a handful of decisive shots in Europe, but each one echoed forward into the Cold War, into Korea, into Vietnam, and into the deserts of Iraq, where Abrams tanks thundered through sandstorms as the undisputed kings of armored warfare. The Sherman won World War II. The Abrams defines modern war. But the tank that linked them, the bridge between past and future, was the M26 Pershing. It was late to its war, but right on time.